When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about what if Laena Velaryon actually did marry King Viserys Targaryen during the Dance of the Dragons time period. This is an event that completely changes everything. As we saw in House of the Dragon, if Laena had actually been betrothed and actually had married Viserys while Alicent Hightower is never on the throne, the Greens lose pretty much all of their bases for power. So we're going to explore this video in a really difficult way because we don't know a lot of the ways certain events exactly happen, like how do certain people die exactly, who is behind it. So I'm going to try to piece it together as best I can. I also want to make this as little of a fan fiction as possible, so I want to keep certain things kind of the same. Like if Laena marries somebody else, I still want her to have only the children that she does have, because then you start speculating, okay, well, if Laena has sons now, how does that change everything up? I'm just going to try to keep it as close to the events of Fire and Blood as possible with changing one event. So let's get into it. Let's break into it. So we get into 105 AC. Laena is only 12 years old, and she is basically being betrothed, suggested for Viserys to marry. It makes a lot of sense at this point, given that the Velaryons are the only other dragon riders outside of the Targaryens. The Targaryens themselves are at a very weak point in terms of the amount of Targaryens. The only Targaryens at this point are Rhaenys and her line with the Velaryons, Viserys, and then Daemon, and then also Rhaenyra Targaryen. So if you're looking at the main line in terms of Viserys, Daemon, well, Viserys is the only one that had any kids, and Rhaenyra was the only kid. So you're in a really tough situation. You want to have Viserys remarry because there needs to be more Targaryens. What if Rhaenyra was to say, die in childbirth? At that point, you would have the Targaryen line almost dying. So it did make sense to then try and have more Targaryens, because Daemon was not very fond of Rhea Royce, his wife at the time. It made sense to kind of connect the two Targaryen lines. It's exactly what it was for. It was supposed to solve any type of civil war because there had been boiling issues between the Velaryon side of things and the Viserys side of things since the Great Council. So it makes a lot of sense to unite the claims. But what does it do instantly for this timeline? Well, Otto Hightower and Alicent, they were at this point trying to get on the throne. They were trying to gain power. This is something we've seen with the Hightowers all the way back to Maegor in his youth when he was married to a Hightower himself. Now, I want to point this out. There comes an interesting issue, because even though Laena marries Viserys, the issue of the succession is not solved. It still doesn't instantly fix this issue, because Laena only has 2 girls. And so I want to continue off that. I don't want to speculate at Laena having more children or any of that stuff. I'm just going to plug in what we saw with Laena with Daemon, but with Viserys. Laena is still going to die at a very young age, and she's going to have 2 children, but both of them are going to be girls. Now, the other part of this is, does Viserys keep Rhaenyra as his rightful heir, which it seems likely he would. Rhaenyra is his oldest daughter, and because Laena only has daughters, you don't have the same issue that you do with Alicent, where she actually has sons. You have a male claimant. So this changes a lot of things in the dynamics going on. One, Laena and Rhaenyra were very good friends, and I don't think that would just break because Laena was forced to marry Viserys. I don't think that would happen. There seemed to be a lot more going on in Fire and Blood because of the age difference between Rhaenyra and Alicent. It wasn't like it was in the show. There was very much a difference in the two characters. They were not like that close. Like this, they were said to be friendly with each other, but then that kind of broke up or whatever. But the real relationship in the book was supposed to be Laena and Rhaenyra. They were best friends, not Alicent and Rhaenyra. The show kind of combined that into the character of Alicent, and unfortunately stripped everything away from Laena, which is crazy to me because season 1 and season 2 has done its best to just have the Velaryons barely have screen time, but that's a whole different conversation. So Viserys is left in a quite interesting position, because when Laena dies, we also know that Laenor dies that same year. So at this point, Daemon is also in an interesting point, because I want to shift back to Daemon while all this is happening, because we know that Daemon loses his wife in Rhea Royce, and there's been some suspicion about that, but I will say this. Daemon was in the Stepstones when his wife dies, so unless he hired somebody to kill Rhea Royce, it was not him personally. So Daemon is now a free agent. But the issue Daemon runs into is, Well, he is still second in line. He's very close to the throne. In terms of, if you look at how some people would view the Targaryen line of succession, some people would view that Daemon is the rightful heir. The only reason Daemon gets discounted because Viserys starts having male sons. So in that point, you can't argue the whole male thing because Viserys has males of his own, and so Daemon falls. But in this situation, Daemon is technically, in the line of succession, if you want to go off of Viserys' kids, he's technically fourth behind 3 women. But in a lot of ways, Daemon would also be viewed by a lot of people as the true heir, being the male claimant. Based on the Great Council, it would imply that Daemon should be the king after Viserys' death. Now, I know Viserys does not actually agree with that. So Daemon's in a weird spot. And this is where I think this is where it gets interesting, is Otto Hightower and Daemon hate each other. Of course, we know that to be the case. But would those two team up? In a way, this is very interesting because Alicent and Daemon, there is a rumor in Fire and Blood that Daemon actually took Alicent's maidenhead. So maybe there was some relationship there already. Maybe Alicent had a little bit of a crush on Daemon. Would Otto then try to get Alicent to go with Daemon? It makes sense because at the moment, Daemon would be the person that could have an argument for being king. He had Caraxes. Who knows? And this is the biggest wild card because it really comes down to, would Daemon maybe put aside his ego? Would Otto put aside his ego? And even though these two people hated each other, right? Otto slandered Daemon all the time and Daemon kind of right back in a lot of ways. Would the two put aside their differences and unite in power? I don't think so. I think that Daemon, albeit had his issues with his brother, I don't think he would get in bed with the Hightowers that would be using Daemon to try and usurp the throne, more or less. I just don't see Daemon doing that. And so I think Daemon kind of plays the field for a while. There is no real good match for him. Like Laena, what made her so enticing of a candidate is because, one, she had the fiery Targaryen kind of nature. She had Vhagar. She was kind of like the perfect match for Daemon, in my opinion. Like, I think Daemon's best romantic interest is Laena. And so he doesn't really have anybody that would be a clear match. And even you think about what actually happens with the Stepstones, that likely would not even happen, because a lot of why the Stepstones happens is because Corlys and the Velaryons are kind of shunned because, well, not shunned, but Corlys himself is very much insulted. As Laena is passed over for Alicent, that kind of leads into the Stepstones plot with Daemon. So there's a lot of things that change with the Daemon and Corlys plotline. And I think that's what makes this whole interesting, because if Daemon, maybe he does the Stepstone stuff by himself, or maybe he has some support, now that the Velaryons are tied to the throne, they have more influence, and so the crown is directly attached to Daemon and leading this war effort in the Stepstones. Maybe all that stuff still goes down very similarly. I do think what likely happens is, I think that Daemon realizes his key to the throne, without causing like a civil war or any of those things, is to wait for Rhaenyra. Because Rhaenyra is in a weird spot where she's married to Laenor, but Laenor did not seem interested in women, and their children did not seem to be Laenor's, they seemed to be Harwin Strong's. I think Daemon would have saw the opportunity to just wait until Laenor dies, or something of that nature, and Daemon tries to get with Rhaenyra. We already saw that maybe Rhaenyra had something for Daemon, and that's what happens. In the wake of Laenor's death, Daemon and Rhaenyra basically instantly marry. And that is, in my opinion, the best version of events. Because if Daemon marries Rhaenyra, it unites the Daemon claim with the Rhaenyra claim. And I also think that Viserys would have had his children marry into Rhaenyra's children. I think that makes sense as well. You unite all the claims of House Targaryen. So you have Baela and Rhaena, just like how they do in the normal story. They're going to be matched with Luke and also Jace. And that fixes all the succession issues in a nice little bow. And that's really all that needs to happen. Daemon then gets with Rhaenyra. That line, when Viserys dies, whether it happens quicker, whether it doesn't, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Daemon and Rhaenyra ascend the Iron Throne, and there's no war. With that being said, would there be issues down the line? Maybe in terms of Daemon and Rhaenyra's children versus the children that Rhaenyra had probably with Harwin Strong. It's possible. We just don't know. And so this is where we kind of get into the fan-fiction-y part of this, because there's no way to predict, right? Otto Hightower at this point has no way of getting the Hightowers into the throne. Like, there's no real way. you would have to kick that down the line once again. Maybe like after Rhaenyra and Daemon pass and their children come into power, the Hightowers could then try to make another play for the throne a little bit later on. There'd be a lot more Targaryens, given how many children Rhaenyra has. Maybe there's that chance, right? That as the Targaryens go to the opposite, there's so many of them, there comes another succession crisis down the line. And I've always said this, the dance was going to happen regardless. Just because it doesn't happen here and in this timeline of a what if, it doesn't mean it's never going to happen. And it's more likely to happen. The more Targaryens you introduce, the more likely you have for people, like a Maegor or a Daemon Targaryen, people that are very willful, that are very good at war, and believing that maybe they have a claim above maybe a weaker brother or a weaker sibling, like an Aenys, for instance. It was always going to happen. I will say, I think for the short term, this really helps the Targaryen dynasty. It prevents the dance from happening and probably prolongs the Targaryen dynasty for at least another generation, probably. So let me know what you guys think. This is a really hard one to talk about because Daemon's arc is by far the hardest to predict because you don't know what he would do. He's such a morally gray, interesting character. Would he try to do something else? Would he maybe have Rhaenyra assassinated so that he could be on the throne? Like, there's so many different things you can look at with Daemon, and it's really your interpretation of the character. If you believe he's a lot more of a evil-sided character, you might believe he does something differently here. If you're like me and you believe he's very much morally gray, he does his good actions and his bad actions, I believe this is the outcome that would happen. I just don't know. But let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.